with my CMU colleagues, Ashley Lai, Minh Lee, YoungSeok, Yoon, Andrew Faulring, and my great-grand advisee, Joel Brandt, who's now at Adobe. And the talk is about selective undo, and in context, we need to compare that to the regular linear undo that we're all familiar with from pretty much all of today's applications. You have a set of operations you do in some order, and then you want to undo one, and you want to do the next one, and then you can change your mind and redo one. But if you go ahead and do something new, then it throws away the last operation, operation D, so it can retain this linear list of operations. And there's no way to get back to D, the operation D after this point. Another limitation of regular undo is if you like D but you don't like C, there's no way to undo just C. So that's the whole point of selective undo, is that you go back in time and say, I don't like C anymore, but I still want to keep D. So how can we achieve that? It turns out there's two basic models that have been explored. There's a bunch of other ones that no one likes, but there are two models that are relatively successful. The most common is what's called the inverse model, and that's where you take the reverse of the operation you don't like and do it now, or do it at the end of the history. So the idea is that if C was the create of an object, then the not C would be the delete of that same object. Or if C is change color, then not C would be change it back. And so you just do the reverse of the operation in the current context. The advantage of this is that you never really lose anything. Even if you do new stuff, you can always go back to any previous state. The other model is called the script model, and that's where you try and pretend that the operation never happened. So you kind of take it out of the history, and then you execute all of the operations as if you had never done C. And the problem with that, of course, is what happens if D depended on C. So C was created of an object, and D has changed that object's color. What does that mean to change the color of an object that no longer was created? So selective undo has been extensively explored in drawing programs. These are programs like Illustrator, PowerPoint, where you have specific objects. And we did a paper about this in '98 here at CHI. We also have explored selective undo in the context of text editing programs. And YoungSeok will be presenting that work at SIGCHI in a month in Florence. But what we're talking about today are painting programs. And these are programs where you operate on pixels instead of on objects. And pixel operations are things like blur and smudge and paint bucket, which is technically flood fill. There's no objects in a painting program. They're just pixels. And the most famous painting program currently is Photoshop. But it's important to remember that Photoshop has a lot of object-oriented functions in it. But we're not really talking about those. We're focusing on the painting pixel operations. So what is the issue with selective undo in painting programs? Well, it turns out the inverse model, which we tried to think about originally, actually can't work in a painting program because there's no objects to reverse things. So imagine the second operation here was to change the color of the background to its current blue color. The subsequent operations have smudged that color in with other colors. So there's nothing that you can do right now in the current state that would change the color of the background successfully. On the other hand, the script model can kind of work because there's no object dependencies. So these consistency problems that we had don't actually come up. So we had this desire to investigate selective undo in the context of painting programs, so we weren't really sure what that would mean and what would be the specific requirements. And there also turned out to be a bunch of interesting design issues, which we go into detail in the paper about. And so we wanted to find out what people would expect. So Joel told us that there are three primary uses of Photoshop. The most popular is actually to design user interfaces. The second most popular is as artists to create art. Use it as a drawing program for art. And the third, even though it's in the name of the tool, the least popular use is actually to do anything with photos. So in order to make sure we had a good representation of how people are using the tool, we looked at a variety of people across these three categories who did use Photoshop for these three things. We had some experts and novices and intermediates, students and professionals. And sure enough, they did use a variety of the undo features that are in Photoshop, and they did have a lot of great insights that helped us understand what we should do in our new tool. So step backwards, of course, was really popular. Another thing that was very clear is that people who are Photoshop experts use layers a lot, and they use it primarily as a way of separating their different drawings, and therefore as kind of a way of enabling the selective undo. So if you have a a layer, you can hide it or delete it, and therefore do those sets of operations over again. The result of this is that people tend to have a lot of layers, and so that gets to be kind of hard to manage. And sometimes they would, of course, forget to put things on a layer by themselves, or they would put things together incorrectly on layers by accident. And so if something was messed up on a layer and they wanted to undo it, typically they would start over. That there really was no good undo mechanism that they had available to them if stuff was on the same layer. And sure enough, the kind of operations that we're thinking about, like smudge and flood fill, do not work across layers. You have to merge the layers in order to get these kind of pixel operations. So that seemed like a good motivation for the kind of things we want to do. So we decided to try and build a tool to investigate this further and see if we could actually reduce the need for using layers because they could use the selective undo as a substitute for having to put things on their own layers. And we wanted to put this into Photoshop, but at the time there was not a good API for doing the low-level kinds of operations we wanted. Joel tells us there is one now, so that's cool. But at the time there wasn't, and so we looked for an open source editor, and we settled on Pixelator, which was in Java, which was good because we knew how to program in Java. And this is what it looks like. We called it Aquamarine because that's a cool acronym. It stands for Allowing Quick Undoing of Any Marks and Repairs to Improve Novel Editing, of course. Aquamarine uses the script model, as we said, and it still provides the conventional linear undo as well on top of the selective undo that we are going to add to it. And we looked at all the operations in Photoshop and grouped them into different classes and made sure we had representative examples of each of the classes of operations that we wanted to support. And just like Photoshop, we put the list of operations into a history panel, but naturally our history panel has lots of special features. And we had the ability to find which operations you wanted based on the screen regions, which was one of the key things that our users told us they wanted. The editor supports regular painting operations like using the brush and painting shapes. Other painting operations like the paint bucket can also be used to modify the pixels. The history panel on the right shows the operations as the user performs them. Each entry in the history panel shows a count and the name of the operation. There is also a thumbnail image zoomed in on what the operation did, along with a little context around that part of the picture. As the user moves the cursor up and down in the history, the preview at the top of the history panel shows what the whole picture looked like at that point. The conventional linear undo, which is called step forwards and backwards in Photoshop, is always available to undo and redo the recent operations. To find what area was affected by an operation, users can look at the thumbnails, toggle the selective undo of that operation and see what changes, or they can use a command to find the specific region of the picture that the command affected. Alternatively, users can select a region of the screen and ask what commands have affected that area, which our participants reported would be a really useful feature in general. Okay, so that's kind of the general way it works. It's pretty much the same as any other painting program, and the history panel so far is somewhat similar to what you would find in Photoshop. So we wanted to add selective undo with the script model, and so we implemented the script model in pretty much the obvious way, which is to roll back to the operation before the one you want to selectively undo, skip the one that you didn't want anymore, and then roll forward. The first design issue was how would we let people say which operation they wanted to selectively undo. And so we had two designs, so let's see what those look like. We created two versions of the history panel to explore how people would want to see and perform selective undo. In this version, the user selects an operation to be undone, which is shown in blue. Then, the user can invoke selective undo command, which adds the selective undo operation to the end of the history, referencing the number of the undone operation and graying out that item to show it is undone. Also note that if the user selectively undoes an operation so that it is no longer in effect, then the thumbnails below that point update to show what the picture looks like now with that operation skipped. The user can redo this operation 3 different ways: by using the regular undo Control-Z command to undo the selective undo, by selecting the undo operation and selectively undoing it, or selecting the original operation and invoking the selective redo command. Note that the user can selectively redo any operation, no matter whether it was undone using selective undo or the regular undo. The other versions of the history has a check mark with each item in the history, and the user can selectively undo or redo an operation by toggling the check mark, and the operation is again grayed out when it has been undone. Selective undo and redo operations are not put in the history in this version, but just modify the operations directly. Also, regular undo cannot be used to undo the selective undo or redo. Regular undo just moves up from the bottom of the history. So one of the another design issue we had is the issue of region conflicts. So we talked about how you can't have object conflicts in painting programs, but you can still have multiple operations that affect the same region of the screen. And the question is what should happen in that case. So imagine you draw some lines, then you can do a fill of the area in between the lines. Okay, then you selectively undo the drawing of one of those lines. So now you have this gap there. So what should happen in the selective undo situation? The obvious thing is that the flood fill sneaks out of that little hole there and fills the whole screen. You may not be surprised to know that nobody really liked that idea. But we had a surprisingly broad range of ideas about what should happen instead. So in order to address this, we highlighted in the history the conflicting operations, since we couldn't figure out something automatic to do, and let the user then make their own determination about which ones of those operations they'd want to undo in addition. We did a usability evaluation of the final version of the tool with another 8 people. One of these was the same as the first group, and the others are all new. And these were experts and novices and intermediates, professionals and students, again, across all 3 uses of Photoshop. Similar backgrounds as before, except nobody in this group had heard of the history brush. And we counterbalance the order that they saw the 2 versions, but nobody liked the one with the selective undo in the history, even though that's kind of the chronological order. Everybody preferred the check marks because they're just so much clearer. No one wanted this paint to flood out and fill the whole canvas, but once that happened, everyone kind of got the idea of what happened. They understood why that happened. So we wanted to look and see what kind of things we could do about that. Everybody was excited about the idea of having selective undo and wanted it in their programs. They also were lots of great brainstorming about other kinds of editors in which they might apply selective undo as well. So in future work, what we're working on right now is editing the past, which everybody asked for. So as soon as you want to undo something in the past, there's a natural request to add something. So we've got these 3 lines that are left, and people would like to add a new line. It's in a new place back in the past before the flood fill, so that then they could flood fill this new shape that they just created. It turns out that editing the past has all sorts of interesting usability issues as well, and hopefully we'll report on that next year at CHI 2016. We have to do more usability tests. Unfortunately, this version is not stable enough to release yet. We hope to get that done, and of course, we are excited about this spreading selective undo into lots of different domains. Thanks.
We have some time for questions, if you have some questions.
Fan Du from University of Maryland. So I think this paper focuses on pixel level of operations, but very often we have both pixel level and object level. They are mixed together, like Photoshop. Mm-hmm. So do you think your method can be generalized to those mixture situations?
Yeah, so people have explored the script model with object-based programs, and it's not too hard using dependency analysis to figure out which operations in the future will be disabled or somehow made impossible by the operations in the past. So yeah, you could probably implement both the object and the painting operations using the script model. We haven't done any research to figure out if that's what people would expect or want to happen for object-based editing. So we'd certainly want to do a little user research to see if that would be useful, but it's certainly feasible.
I have another quick question. So in the filling example, it caused disaster because you remove one line, they fill the whole screen. So do you think the software should like alert the user when they try to remove those one line, tell them it may cause some disaster, you should be aware of that?
Yeah.
Do you still want to remove this line, do you think?
Right, so that's basically what the orange highlighting does in the history panel, that when you, since the blue one is selected, if you uncheck the blue one, then it's telling you that the paint bucket operation will be affected by it. It turns out that a kind of naive approach of what operations might be affected is a little too aggressive, and so we wouldn't want to do a pop-up or anything because there's all sorts of other operations which may be affected by it. And the system can't really tell, what the user, can't read the user's mind about what they wanted to have happen. And so we thought this was kind of a good intermediate step to just warn them, like you said, that this is conflict.
Thank you very much.
So I'm Daniel Sundin from University of Glasgow, and you mentioned earlier that you wanted to affect the use or reduce the use of layers with this work, and I think the work is excellent and fascinating, but I'm unclear a little bit how the final outcomes of this relates to reduced use of layers, and also if that actually is a desirable effect.
Yeah, so the general idea is that say you had the kitty cat and you wanted to explore the whiskers, right? And so in Photoshop, if you're a professional artist, you would draw the whiskers on their own layer. And then you would try some other whiskers, and you could just delete the layer or erase everything on the layer and not affect the rest of the picture. So the idea is that instead of using a layer for that, it's always possible to go back into history, select the whiskers, and remove them by removing the drawing of them. And then you could draw them anew in the past or in the current state. So that was the thought and the motivation. The tool, unfortunately, is not of sufficient quality yet that we could actually see if it worked by deploying it for people to make real-life drawings on it. I think that's really the only way we would know if it was succeeding at being a good alternative to layers. But we definitely saw in our initial studies, initial field work, that people made way more layers than they needed logically just to support this kind of selective undo. And they'd often lose track of them and things like that. So it wasn't unusual to see a project with hundreds of layers. And that's, a management problem.
Absolutely. All right. Brilliant. Thanks very much.
All right. Let's thank Brad and all of our speakers again.